Although it may be flawed, Ark is a great game for a lot of reasons. The main reason I think it's such a great game is because of its diverse cast of creatures. Sure, I enjoy using classics like the Rex, Pteranodon, and Giga as much as the next guy, but Ark has so much more to offer than these beloved meta creatures. Today, I'll be ranking what I consider to be the top 15 hidden gem creatures inside of the game in hopes of answering one simple question. What is the most underrated creature inside of Ark? The criteria I'll be using is how unique and cool the creature's kit of abilities is, how viable or useful the creature actually is inside of the game, and, of course, how overlooked the creature is. I'll explain why a creature is not used by the vast majority of players through listing off its flaws, then I'll explain everything that is useful or cool about the creature and why I use them. Hopefully after watching this video, you'll see these creatures in a new light, and on your next playthrough you'll consider using some of them even if you've never have before. Without further ado, sit back, relax, and let's get into number 15. At number 15, I have the Carno. There's a couple reasons why the Carno isn't used very often by many players. The first reason why players don't use them is because they're just not good for bosses, plain and simple. The problems are two things. One, its stats just don't match up against things like the Rex, which are obviously much more meta for fighting bosses. And the second thing is that their headbutt does a bleed effect on most creatures, but the bleed effect doesn't affect bosses, so it doesn't rip through them like the Deinonychus, for example. The second thing is that they don't get a pack buff. For example, the Allosaurus is much better as an option than the Carno just because it has such a strong pack buff. Going with 3 or 4 of those guys at once, they can absolutely rip through things. The Carno just doesn't have that feature. The third creature that overshadows the Carno is the Baryonyx, because the Baryonyx is just way stronger in the water. It's faster, it has the tail spin ability, it just handles a lot of water problems a lot better than the Carno. So yeah, you don't really want to use it in that application either. With all the Carno's flaws out of the way, let's get into the reasons why you should consider using it. First of all, the Carno is very suitable for strength in regards to the early and middle game especially. This really comes in handy when you realize how accessible the Carno is to early game players. The Carno spawns in safe, easily accessible areas for early game players, and the saddle is unlockable at level 46, which is extremely early in the game. The Carno also comes equipped with a headbutt, which inflicts bleed on the opponent, as well as being more powerful than a basic attack. The other unique attack the Carno has is the charge attack, which I personally don't use. I just think it costs too much stamina and is too slow for the small reward of damage you get from the end of it. It does have some niche use cases, but I just avoid it. The best application for the Carno is definitely as a cave runner in my opinion. They're deceptively small, so you can actually fit them into a lot of caves in the game, and any cave you can fit a Carno into becomes a complete breeze. At number 14, I have the Megalodon and the Xiphactinus. I'm going to group these two underwater creatures together because I think they're on this list for extremely similar reasons, and I don't think having them in different slots on this list is unique enough. The cons for both of these two is they're obviously weaker individually than the Mosa, Tuso, or Basilo, which are the go-tos for underwater exploration. The other two pretty large issues with both of these is that they both get grabbed by Tusos and can get shocked by eels, and both of these downsides can be pretty inconvenient. In terms of the pros for these though, there's a lot to talk about. Firstly, these two creatures get the best pack buff in the game outside of compies, being able to pack buff up to 8 creatures with a strong 10% buff to the Xiphactinus and 8.5% buff to the Megalodon. And just to clarify for people who may have forgotten this or didn't know this, pack bonuses do stack, so you would get 7 buffs per Xiphactinus in a pack if you had an 8-person pack. Just ridiculous. The Megalodon is equipped with a Gnash Bite that drains 5% of the target's health over 5 seconds, and the Xiphactinus has bleed effects that are even stronger than that. These two creatures are also very easily accessible to early game players, just like the Carno, which is a nice feature. I personally use an army of Xiphactinus when I go underwater into caves now, and I have a Basilo that I ride on myself, and this strategy works just as well with Megalodons. You're safe, you can't be stunned off by eels, you can't be grabbed by Tuzos, and you're supported by damage-dealing Xiphactinus or Megalodon packs that do crazy work and can kill everything in your path. One last thing I want to mention for each of these creatures individually is the Megalodon comes with a tech saddle, which is very nice. It's the only underwater creature that gets a tech saddle besides the Mosa. And the Xiphactinus is able to grab small creatures and is able to jump on land to relocate, on top of it having just ridiculously good speed to ride on in general. A lot of players will just completely skip these creatures to get to late game underwater content faster, which in my opinion is a complete crime. They're just too good not to use. They would be much higher on my list if I was purely basing it off strength. The only reason they're this low is because I do think some people definitely take advantage of these creatures, so they're not as underrated as some of the other guys. At number 13, I have the Megalosaurus. In regards to the cons, there's only 2 for the Megalosaurus. 1, its base stats are super low, so it can die to a lot of PvE creatures if you're not careful. And 2, the female Megalosaurus just doesn't really have any functionality. In terms of the pros, the male Megalosaurus is an extremely good thatch farmer, and both the male and female Megalosaurus are very fast ground mounts. The male Megalosaurus is also equipped with a dash that can just go straight through trees, so there's no obstacles at all, it's just extremely high speed. One more funny thing about this creature is it can actually give a human a bleed effect when hitting them with the charge attack, and it causes a 20% health loss and blocks healing items during the duration of the bleed, which is ridiculously strong, and I somehow didn't even know about this until I started researching for this video. At number 12, I have the Iguanodon. The only con about the Iguanodon is it's pretty weak statistically, so if you do get approached by a predator and you're not able to run away, you're generally probably going to die to it. The first pro about this guy is that he has two stances, one on his hind legs and one on all fours. When he's all fours, he's extremely fast on the ground, and when he's on his hind legs, he can jump pretty high, so he's able to traverse a lot of terrain. The Iguanodon is a good berry farmer, and it can turn berries into seeds in its inventory, which is a completely unique ability that is very useful. One of the best things about the Iguanodon too is that you can take vegetable crops, put it in its inventory, and turn those into seeds as well, so it's absolutely a must-have for early game farming. At number 11, I have the Kentrosaurus. The two problems the Kentro has actually come from the same issue. It doesn't have a saddle. The big issue is that you obviously can't ride it, which is a very nice feature to have in any creature that's tameable, but the second issue is that it doesn't get the extra armor buff from having a saddle, which would have made this thing even stronger than it already is. To start off the pros, let's talk about the reflection damage of the Kentro, which is ridiculous. Kentros are so strong that if you have a pack of them and then you have a Giga attack that pack, it'll get enraged almost immediately. You can even take out weaker bosses like the Megapithecus because the Kentros just have such high health pools at high levels, and the reflective damage is just absurd. One of the main reasons the Kentro is so strong though is the pack bonus. The max pack size for a Kentro is 4, and the damage increase is 5% per member, which is so strong here. The last thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the Kentro can pierce and grab small creatures or humans with their tail whip attack and inflict a bleed effect. This is pretty threatening because killing the Kentro to get out of the tail whip can take a while due to its tankiness, and it can kill you in this time span. Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the list so far. I just wanted to take a brief moment again to let everyone know that there's a giveaway for a copy of Ark 2 going on in my Discord over the next few weeks. Link is in the description. I'd really appreciate if you checked it out. Without further ado, let's get into Ark's top 10 most underrated creatures. The Baryonyx comes in at number 10 on my list. In terms of things that are holding the Baryonyx back, the first major issue is its low HP pools, which makes it really not a viable option for boss fights. Another issue that comes up for the Baryonyx is simply finding a high level one sometimes. On certain maps, the spawn count for these guys is pretty low, and finding high tier Baryonyx saddles can prove to be a challenge depending on the playthrough, which definitely isn't helpful. To start off the positives, let's talk about how the Baryonyx does in the water. The Baryonyx is a fast swimmer that comes equipped with a tail whip that can stun enemies. The only downside of this is that the Baryonyx cannot stun super small creatures like the jellyfish and cannot stun huge creatures like the Moza and the Tuzo. One more perk for the Baryonyx is that it doesn't have an oxygen stat, so it can stay underwater as long as you need it to. The Baryonyx is also fairly mobile on land and is extremely strong for anything outside of bosses. Its hitbox, similar to the Carno, is also pretty small, which makes it a good cave option for both the terrestrial caves and the underwater caves. At number 9, I have the Calicotherium. The Calicotherium's main flaw is that it's slow and not very strong in straight up combat. It's also a pain in the ass to tame because it only spawns in annoying areas and requires beer. This makes it basically inaccessible until the mid game, and by then it sort of falls off, but there are still reasons you should use it in the late game. Here's why. One perk is that it's a very nice berry farmer, but that's not really the reason you would tame one of these guys. The reason is because it's basically a turret. The Calicotherium has a projectile that poisons and impairs the vision of targets hit. If melee is pumped, this projectile can do seriously insane damage. There's actually one really useful application for this, which is that you can put it on the back of a platform saddle, which is something that the Rock Elemental just isn't capable of. If the Velonosaur isn't available, the Calicotherium is the best way to defend your base through creature turrets. And even if the Velonosaur is available, having the Calicotherium slowing and impairing of vision combined with the Velonosaur is a really lethal combo. At number 8, I have the Procoptodon. So the big issue for the Procoptodon is that it's been a little bit overshadowed in the breeding department since the release of the Maywing and the Gigantoraptor. The other issue is that it's also been overshadowed in the movement department by the Maywing, which kind of sucks, but the Procoptodon is still good for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a great berry farmer. The Procoptodon, similar to the Maywing and Gigantoraptor, can carry babies in its pouch, which is extremely useful. It gives imprinting boosts and can carry creatures to new locations, so it's great for transportation and raising. The Procoptodon also just has very good mobility by itself, using its high jump to go long distances very quickly, and it also has great weight, so it's a very good early game farming creature because it can carry a lot of resources back to your base when you don't have things like Argies. It's just an exceptional early game creature for not only mobility, but also farming. One last little piece of tech here for the Procoptodon is that if you go with it into the Broodmother arena, you can jump up onto the mushroom and shotgun the boss with no risk of dying. It's very overpowered, and it's just another reason why this thing is so great. At number 7, I have the Spinosaurus. So the only real problem for Spinos is that they're just not as good at boss fights as Rexes. And there's actually another reason on top of this that they're not as strong besides the stats. The other problem involves the AI on the Spinos during the boss fights for the ones that you're not riding. The issue boils down to the fact that these Spinos that you're not riding will randomly select between the swiping and the biting attack when the swiping attack is significantly stronger. If the Spinos were to only use the swiping attack, they would actually be almost as DPS heavy as the Rexes, but the issue is you just cannot physically control what the Spinos do besides the one that you're on. It just leads to a lot of DPS inefficiency in boss fights, so people opt for the Rex, but there is a lot of reasons to like the Spino. Firstly, let's talk about the hydrated buff the Spino gets when around the water. When a Spino touches water, it gets the hydrated buff, which gives it a 30-second buff to speed, health regen, and damage, all by 20% for a 30-second duration after leaving the water, as well as the entire time while it's touching the water. This buff actually makes the Spino very viable for underwater travel because of the swim speed buff and health regen boost. Besides being really strong, really cool, and being strong around the water, the other thing that makes the Spino very powerful is the 2 stances that it comes with. I know I mentioned this earlier as a con for boss fights, but in any other application besides boss fights, this is extremely useful. The 2 stances allow for a variety in capabilities. All fours is faster movement and attack speed, while hind legs is stronger and has more agility due to being able to turn 180 degrees almost perfectly in place. Very underrated and useful tool, by the way. Being able to essentially turn on a dot and having extremely good control of your dinosaur is something that a lot of these other high-level creatures sorely lack. At number 6, I have the Moss Chops. The downsides for the Moss Chops are extremely simple. Super weak stats, it's super slow, and it doesn't come with a saddle, so it doesn't get any extra armor to compensate for the 2 first problems. The pros easily outweigh the cons in this case though. Firstly, the Moss Chops is an exceptional harvester of just about everything inside of the game. It's arguably the best harvester inside of the game. It farms lots of fiber, chitin, berries, rare mushrooms, rare flowers, polymer, and meat, which is just an absurd amount of things for one creature to farm, especially considering you can tame one of these 5 minutes into a playthrough. You can also select resources for it to farm, and it will farm them autonomously as you're doing other tasks if there is the resource in the area, which is extremely helpful. The Moss Chops, just to emphasize again, is so easy to tame and use immediately because of no saddle. Even though it's weak and slow, it doesn't really matter. It serves its purpose extremely well, and it not having a saddle actually could be viewed as a pro as opposed to a con, just because it makes the creature so accessible to any player at any level of progression. Hello again everyone. Over the weekend, I'll be hosting a tournament of polls on my community tab. The winning creatures from this tournament will be what I use to beat Ark in a future video. So subscribe and help me hit my goal of 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year so you don't miss out. Alright, let's get into the top 5. At number 5, I have the Beezle Bufo. Just for context, finding cons for these top 5 creatures is a little bit more challenging than it has been for the rest of the list, so I'm kind of pulling at straws here. There's only 3 issues I can even think of for the Beezle Bufo. One is that it spawns in annoying areas like the swamp, and it's really hard to tame some of these things early game sometimes. 2, it's naturally slow. Obviously, if you use the jumps, it's a lot quicker, and if you're swimming, it's a lot quicker, but it's naturally slow on land if you're just normally running, which, yet again, you really shouldn't be doing. And 3, it cannot attack underwater, which is genuinely the only actual issue with the creature. The first good thing about the Beezle Bufo is it's a ridiculously fast swimmer, and it has great land speed as well when you're jump chaining. Combining these 2 attributes makes the Beezle Bufo a really good early game mobility mount. The giant frog also comes with a torpor inflicting tongue attack, which is useful sometimes, can knock out some smaller creatures, but isn't super reliable for anything with a large torpor count. The Beezle Bufo really shines though in the farming department, specifically for cementing paste. It's the best cementing paste farmer in the game by a mile, and it farms cementing paste directly from bugs, which is incredibly efficient. I mean, seriously, just watch this clip of me farming with the Beezle Bufo in the background. I'm getting so much cementing paste, it's not even funny, and it's so fast. At number 4, I have one of my favorite flyers in the game, the Tapejara. The 2 biggest problems for the Tapejara are its speed and its health pool. The health is pretty self-explanatory. The problem with the speed is that it's slower than a Pteranodon, and it doesn't have a high enough weight stat to compensate for it. It's just simply unusable as a farmer, which is totally fine because it compensates in many other ways. The first thing I want to point out for the Tapejara is the ridiculous level of control you have while flying it. You're able to go directly up, down, left, right, on a dot. It's perfect. To add on to the nice mobility features, it can also cling onto walls where it will regain stamina. A really good application for this is, for example, if you're flying over the redwoods and need stamina, you're able to just land on top of a huge tree and avoid all the dangerous things on the bottom. This completely negates the huge problem that people have with the Tapejara having a low health pool, and I think it's a really smart way to do that. Let's talk about the other ridiculously good applications now. Firstly, the Tapejara saddle has 2 seats, and the player in the passenger seat is able to use weapons while on the back of the Tapejara. This is just extremely useful for taming. Being able to fly overhead and track down a creature, you don't even need to build a trap, you can just track it with the Tapejara because it's easily fast enough to follow almost every creature in the game. And you're at a safe distance the entire time. A strategy to take advantage of this as a single player is to go into the passenger seat of the Tapejara and whistle for your Tapejara to follow the creature that you're trying to tame. This works exceptionally well for Quetzals, where you can just be on the backseat of the Tapejara tranking at the Quetzal, while the Tapejara follows passively as the Quetzal flies away. This is a perfect application, super useful, and super easy to implement into your own game. The Tapejara just has so many cool little techniques like this that you can apply to your own game. It's just such a great creature. It also comes with a tech saddle, which is really good for PvP and can make it even stronger in PvE than it already is. The last thing I should note is that when you're lashed onto a wall as the Tapejara rider, you can actually wield weapons during this. The only downside is that you can't really move the mouse freely. It does cut you off in a lot of areas, but it's definitely still cool. I just love the Tapejara. If you haven't ever tried one of these, you absolutely have to give it a try. If it's the only thing you take away from this video, at least try the Tapejara. The only reason the Tapejara isn't higher is just because I think the other three are genuinely more underrated than this one. The Tapejara does get used by some players now, especially in the PvP setting of the game. The other three get almost entirely overlooked by most players, so yeah, I had to put this one at 4. The Dire Bear gets the bronze medal on my list. Although I've placed it really high on my list, the Dire Bear is definitely not without its flaws. Most notably, the Dire Bear has a low health pool, which makes it more like a glass cannon creature than anything, which is not ideal for boss fights. It's also moderately slow until it builds up speed during its charges, which can definitely be detrimental at times when you need to make a quick escape. Especially when obstacles reset the speed a lot of the time during PvE, it's really annoying to actually build up speed with a Dire Bear and travel long distances. The third and final flaw for the Dire Bear is that it's definitely overshadowed by the Therizino in a lot of aspects. With all the cons out of the way, let's get into what makes the Dire Bear truly special. First and foremost, the Dire Bear deals absurd damage, especially when it's at full charge speed, and it's also very fast at top speed. The Dire Bear is also exceptional at gathering honey because the bees don't aggro to it. Other resources that this harvesting beast can gather include berries, fiber, thatch, hide, and meat. It farms all of these very well. Another nice little feature about the Dire Bear, which doesn't really change much, but it is cool, is that it's an omnivore, which means it can eat both berries and meat. The last feature for the Dire Bear that's really good is the insulation you get from the cold while riding it. This is just ridiculously strong, especially in Jotunheim on Fjordur. It's almost a must-have if you don't have an otter. At number 2, I have the Equus. To completely level with you guys, the cons I have listed in my script for the Equus kind of feel like cop-outs. There's really nothing wrong with the Equus. It really does an excellent job at the role it fills inside of the game. With that being said, the 2 cons I listed are that the jump is generally not really good at getting the Equus up to elevated surfaces, and that it's just not as fast as other early game land mounts that we've already mentioned earlier in the video. The first positive attribute about the Equus is that it's a really early game and extremely easy to tame creature, and it doesn't even require a saddle to ride it. That being said, making the saddle is definitely worth it for a couple of reasons. 1, it's extremely cheap and is unlocked at level 20, so there's no reason not to. 2, it has a mortar and pestle inside of it, which is especially useful when the Equus is farming berries and you don't have a full-time base yet because it's so early in the game. And 3, the Equus saddle is the only place in the game where you can craft lassos, which are extremely useful. The lassos are an item that's exclusive to the Equus, and they're able to drag unconscious creatures of any size, as well as small awake creatures. The best application for this is if you knock out a Quetzal high in the air and it falls into a lake, you're able to drag the Quetzal out of the water. It does inflict damage and torpor at the same time, so your taming effectiveness will go down a little bit, but it's better than the creature drowning. The last feature to mention for the Equus is the double-legged kick, which can inflict torpor on targets and knock out a lot of small early game creatures with ease. This is really helpful for not having to craft a bunch of trank arrows in the early game. Very nice feature. At number 1, I have the Sarcosuchus. The cons for the Sarcosuchus are simple. It's pretty slow on land, and it's definitely weaker than the recently added DINOSAURS statistically. To start out with the pros, let's talk about the Sarco in the water. The Sarco has 3 really nice features underwater. 1 is that it has no oxygen stat, so it doesn't lose any air underwater. 2 is that if you dismount it, it doesn't float to the surface, it'll actually stay down there and wait for you. And 3, it scares off piranhas, which is a nice quality of life thing to have. The other thing to consider for the Sarco underwater is that it's a really fast swimmer, so it really ties everything else together and is really good at avoiding pretty much any threat that it could possibly face. You can also use a crossbow while on the back of the Sarco, so taming underwater creatures by using this fast beast is a really effective method. The Sarco also comes with 3 different versatile attacks, so it's no slouch in the strength department. It has a bite, a death roll, and a pounce, and all 3 of these can be pretty useful in certain situations. For how early you can get the Sarco in the game and how easily accessible it is, plus how easy it is to find really good saddles for the Sarco, I just think that this is the most underrated creature in Ark. There's nowhere near enough people using this thing. It's a go-to for me on every single playthrough to get one so I can go down into the underwater and tame high-level water creatures. Just such a nice creature to have, super underrated. It's the absolute epitome of what underrated means. Well, that's my list. If you've made it this far into the video, then I'm sure you'll enjoy the video linked on screen now, where I rank Ark's 15 rarest creatures of all time. I'll see you there. Bye!